Sit down, boy. First class isn't for people like you. Richard Blackwood didn't whisper it. He announced it to the entire cabin like he was reading company policy. The words cut through the pre-flight chatter at Gate 47, turning heads, stopping conversations. Passengers in the boarding area looked up from their phones. Flight attendants paused mid-step. Even the gate agent's voice faltered over the intercom. What Richard didn't know was that in exactly 11 minutes the boy he just humiliated would ground his entire airline. Because the teenager sitting calmly in seat 2A, he owned every plane in the sky. Before we dive deeper into this moment that would destroy one man's life and change an entire industry, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if this story stops you cold, the way it stopped everyone on Flight 318, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Because what you're about to witness isn't just a story about justice. It's about the moment silence became impossible. Now let's rewind to how this confrontation began 30,000 feet above the ground on what should have been a routine Tuesday afternoon flight from Dallas to Miami. Dallas International Airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Terminal C was a river of rolling suitcases, overpriced coffee, and travelers checking their watches. Gate 47 sat at the end of the concourse where Apex Airways Flight 318 was preparing for its 2:30 p.m. departure. The Boeing 737 gleamed under the afternoon sun, its blue and silver livery pristine against the Texas sky. Inside the aircraft, the pre-boarding ritual was underway. Flight attendants checked overhead bins, adjusted seat cushions, and verified that everything was secure for departure. The plane held 180 passengers across 3 classes, 12 seats in first class, 30 in business, and 138 in economy. It was a full flight, as Tuesday routes to Miami typically were. Richard Blackwood had arrived at the gate with the swagger of a man who believed the world existed to serve him. At 45, he was a senior investment banker at Morrison & Associates, pulling down 7 figures annually and never letting anyone forget it. His charcoal Tom Ford suit was tailored to perfection, his Italian leather shoes gleamed under the terminal lights, and his Patek Philippe watch caught the light every time he gestured, which he did frequently, usually to emphasize his own importance. He'd been on his phone since arriving at the gate, his voice carrying across the waiting area as he berated subordinates, threatened rivals, and generally reminded everyone within earshot that he was very important. The conversation he'd just finished involved firing someone's entire department because a report was 2 hours late. Richard had ended the call with his signature phrase, "Incompetence has consequences." He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. Richard's boarding pass showed seat 2B first class window. He'd paid the upgrade fee without blinking, not because he needed the extra leg room, but because he needed the status. In Richard's world, where you sat determined who you were. And Richard Blackwood was definitely a first-class kind of man. As Zone 1 boarding began, Richard surged toward the gate, cutting in front of an elderly woman with a walker and completely ignoring the gate agent's request for patience. He slammed his boarding pass onto the scanner with the force of someone making a statement, then marched down the jet bridge like he was entering his own private aircraft. The moment Richard stepped onto Flight 318, his mood soured. Because there in seat 2A sat someone who clearly didn't belong. The teenager looked maybe 19, certainly no older. He was black, wearing a faded Howard University hoodie that had seen better days, distressed jeans, and white Nike sneakers that were clean but not new. A worn leather backpack sat in the overhead bin above him. Noise-canceling headphones hung around his neck, and he was quietly reading what appeared to be a thick textbook on aviation law. To Richard Blackwood, this was an affront to the natural order of things. The boy looked up as Richard approached, his dark eyes alert but calm. He had the kind of face that suggested intelligence and composure beyond his years, with strong features and a direct gaze that didn't waver. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "Good afternoon, sir. I believe you're in 2B. Richard's jaw clenched. The politeness somehow made it worse. You're in first class, he said, loud enough for passengers boarding behind him to hear. Where's your escort? The teenager blinked once, slowly. I'm sorry. Your escort. Richard repeated, his voice growing sharper. The person who's supposed to be supervising you. Unaccompanied minors don't fly first class. It's policy. Several passengers had stopped in the aisle behind Richard, creating a bottleneck. Elena Rodriguez, the senior flight attendant, approached with practiced diplomacy. At 32, she'd been flying for Apex Airways for 8 years and had seen her share of passenger conflicts. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform pressed and professional. Is there a problem here, gentlemen? She asked, her slight accent adding warmth to her words. Richard turned to her with obvious relief. Someone in authority who could sort this mess out. This kid is in first class. Obviously, there's been some kind of mistake with the seating. Can you move him to the back where he belongs? Elena glanced at the teenager who had returned to his book as if nothing was happening. She checked her passenger manifest on her tablet, running her finger down the list until she found seat 2A. Sir, she said to Richard, Mr. Williams has a valid first-class ticket. There's no mistake. Williams. Richard's voice dripped with skepticism. Let me see his ID. I bet it's fake. The teenager Marcus Williams looked up again. This time something flickered in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but a kind of recognition. As if he'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. You want to see my identification? Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Damn right I do, Richard shot back. People like you don't just end up in first class unless someone made an error. So let's see some ID and let's see that credit card you supposedly used to upgrade. Marcus reached slowly into his hoodie pocket and withdrew a wallet. It was simple black leather, well worn but well maintained. From it he extracted a driver's license and handed it to Elena. Elena examined the license carefully. Marcus J. Williams, age 19. Texas resident. The name matches our records perfectly. Richard wasn't satisfied. What about the credit card? How's a college kid affording first class? Let's see that black card you supposedly have. Marcus paused for a moment, studying Richard's face. Then he reached back into his wallet and pulled out a credit card. But it wasn't black. It wasn't even platinum. It was a simple Chase student credit card with a $500 limit. Richard's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. There it is, student card. $500 limit. You can't afford a first-class seat with allowance money, kid. Game over. But Elena was still looking at her tablet, scrolling through additional information. Her expression changed as she read further. Mr. Blackwood, she said carefully. Mr. Williams didn't purchase this seat. It was assigned to him as part of his company's corporate travel account. What company? Richard laughed harshly. Let me guess. His daddy's landscaping business? Marcus closed his book slowly and looked directly at Richard. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to fill the small space around them. I don't think my company is relevant to whether I can sit in the seat I was assigned, Marcus said. But if you must know, I work in aviation. Richard's laugh was ugly now, drawing stares from other passengers. Aviation. What you clean the planes? That explains the first class thing. Employee perk, right? The moment stretched taut. Other passengers were openly watching now. Tom Bradley, a 38-year-old high school teacher from Phoenix, had his phone out and was discreetly recording. Maria Santos, a 32-year-old emergency room nurse traveling to visit her sister, was standing in the aisle, her professional instincts telling her this situation was escalating dangerously. Marcus Williams looked at Richard Blackwood for a long moment. In that gaze was something Richard couldn't quite identify. Not fear, not anger, something else entirely. Something that should have warned him to stop. Instead, Marcus simply said, "Yes, sir. I do work in aviation, and in exactly 11 minutes Richard Blackwood would discover that the teenager he was humiliating didn't just work in aviation. He owned it. But first, Richard had to make the biggest mistake of his life. He pointed at Marcus with a manicured finger that trembled with rage. "I don't care what your job is, boy. I don't care what charity program got you this seat. And I don't care about your feelings. This is first class. It's for people who matter, people with money, people with importance. Not—" He gestured dismissively at Marcus's hoodie. "Whatever you are." The cabin had gone completely quiet. Even the boarding process had stopped as flight attendants and passengers alike witnessed the confrontation unfolding in seat row 2. Marcus Williams looked up at Richard Blackwood, his dark eyes steady and calm, and when he spoke his voice was soft as silk and sharp as steel. "Mr. Blackwood," he said quietly, "I think you're going to regret this conversation." Richard laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "Is that a threat, kid?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "No, sir. It's just an observation." And somewhere in the back of Richard's mind a small voice whispered that he should listen to that observation, that he should sit down, buckle his seatbelt, and pretend this conversation had never happened. Instead, Richard Blackwood decided to double down on his hatred. And in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would destroy everything he'd ever worked for, everything he'd ever built, and everything he thought he understood about power. The countdown had begun. 11 minutes to impact. And Richard Blackwood had no idea he was about to crash. Richard Blackwood had built his life on the belief that success was a zero-sum game. For him to win, someone else had to lose. And he'd been winning for a very long time. Born into moderate wealth in Connecticut, Richard had attended the right schools, joined the right clubs, and married the right woman. His father had been a banker, his grandfather had been a banker, and Richard had followed the family tradition with ruthless efficiency. Morrison and Associates had recruited him straight out of Wharton, and he'd climbed the corporate ladder by stepping on anyone who got in his way. His corner office in Manhattan's financial district overlooked the Hudson River. His Park Avenue apartment was featured in architectural magazines, and his Hamptons estate was where senators and CEOs spent their weekends. Richard's annual income exceeded $3.2 million, and he made sure everyone knew it. His suits came from Savile Row, his cars from Stuttgart, and his opinions from a worldview that placed wealthy white men at the center of civilization. But beneath the success, Richard harbored a growing resentment. The world was changing in ways that made him uncomfortable. Young entrepreneurs were becoming billionaires overnight. Women and minorities were ascending to positions he felt belonged to people like him. The natural order, as Richard understood it, was under assault, which was why the sight of Marcus Williams in seat 2A felt like a personal insult. Richard had no way of knowing that the teenager he was confronting had been expecting this moment for months. Marcus Williams had built Apex Airways specifically to address the discrimination he'd experienced throughout his life, and today's flight was part of an ongoing investigation into bias complaints the airline had been receiving. Marcus's story began in a different world entirely. Born in East Baltimore to a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, Marcus had shown an early aptitude for both mathematics and technology that bordered on genius. By age 12, he was taking college-level courses online. By 14, he'd developed a logistics algorithm that could optimize airline routes with 23% greater efficiency than existing methods. The algorithm caught the attention of Dr. Sarah Kim, a professor at Johns Hopkins who was consulting for several major airlines. Dr. Kim became Marcus's mentor, helping him navigate the complex world of aviation technology while protecting him from companies that wanted to buy his innovations for pennies on the dollar. Marcus's first personal experience with airline discrimination came at age 16 when he flew to Silicon Valley for a tech conference. Despite holding a first-class ticket his mentor had purchased, he was questioned by 3 different airline employees, asked to provide additional identification, and ultimately moved to economy for his comfort, because other passengers had complained about his presence. That night in a hotel room paid for by the conference organizers, Marcus Williams made a decision that would change his life and eventually transform an entire industry. He was going to build his own airline. Using his logistics algorithm as collateral, Marcus secured initial funding from a venture capital firm that specialized in underrepresented entrepreneurs. His presentation was flawless. His technology was revolutionary, and his vision was compelling an airline that treated every passenger with dignity, regardless of their appearance, age, or background. The first round of funding brought in $50 million. The second round, 6 months later, brought in $200 million. By the time Marcus turned 18, Apex Airways was operational with a fleet of 12 aircraft and routes connecting major cities across the United States. Marcus's approach to running an airline was unconventional. Instead of focusing solely on profit margins, he emphasized passenger experience and employee satisfaction. Apex Airways flight attendants were paid 40% above industry standard. Customer service representatives were empowered to solve problems immediately rather than transferring passengers through endless phone trees. Most importantly, the company had zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. But Marcus knew that policies on paper meant nothing if they weren't enforced in reality, which was why, despite being worth $3.2 billion and owning controlling interest in one of America's fastest-growing airlines, he still flew coach to conferences, wore his college hoodies in airports, and carefully observed how his company's employees treated passengers who didn't look like traditional first-class travelers. The complaints about Flight 388's crew had been accumulating for weeks. Gate agents who questioned minority passengers' ticket validity. Flight attendants who were slower to respond to requests from certain travelers. Subtle but unmistakable patterns that suggested bias was creeping into his company despite all training and policies. Today's flight was Marcus's chance to experience that bias firsthand. He'd booked seat 2A under his real name, but made no effort to identify himself to the crew. To them, he was just another passenger. A young black man in casual clothes with a student credit card and an economy mindset who'd somehow ended up in first class. As Richard continued his verbal assault, Marcus made mental notes of every word, every gesture, every failure by his employees to intervene appropriately. Elena Rodriguez, the senior flight attendant, was following company policy by checking his identification and confirming his ticket. But she wasn't addressing Richard's obvious harassment, and she certainly wasn't enforcing Apex Airways' strict anti-discrimination guidelines. Meanwhile, other passengers were beginning to take sides. Tom Bradley, the teacher from Phoenix, had started recording because he recognized the signs of a situation that was about to escalate. His experience with teenage students had taught him to spot adults who used their size and authority to intimidate children, and Richard Blackwood fit the profile perfectly. Maria Santos was having a different reaction entirely. As an emergency room nurse, she'd seen the aftermath of verbal confrontations that turned physical. Richard's body language was aggressive, his voice was escalating, and the teenager he was targeting was remaining calm in a way that often provoked bullies to violence. She was calculating how quickly she could intervene if the situation deteriorated. David Park, a 42-year-old software engineer in seat 3C, was live tweeting the confrontation to his 15,000 followers. He'd started with a simple observation about entitled passenger harassing kid in first class, but was now documenting what appeared to be clear racial harassment on a commercial flight. The irony was overwhelming. Richard Blackwood was destroying his own life in front of an audience on an aircraft owned by his victim, while being recorded by passengers who would ensure his humiliation became public record. But he was so blinded by his own sense of superiority that he couldn't see the trap he was building around himself. Marcus, meanwhile, was conducting a master class in what his mother had taught him about dignity under fire. Never raise your voice. Never show anger. Let your actions speak louder than your words. Most importantly, never let anyone reduce you to their level of behavior. But Marcus was also conducting a different kind of master class, one in strategic patience. Every word Richard spoke was being heard by potential witnesses. Every moment Elena failed to intervene was being noted for her performance review. Every second that Captain Morrison remained unaware of the situation in his first-class cabin was being logged for future training discussions. Richard Blackwood thought he was teaching a lesson about social hierarchy. Instead, he was providing evidence for his own prosecution. The other passengers in first class were watching with varying degrees of discomfort. Mrs. Patricia Chen, an elderly widow traveling to visit her grandchildren, kept glancing between Richard and Marcus with obvious distress. She'd lived through the civil rights era and recognized the familiar pattern of discrimination, but at 78 she wasn't sure she had the energy for confrontation. Dr. James Wilson, a cardiologist flying to a medical conference, was struggling with his own response. His professional training told him to remain neutral, but his personal ethics were screaming that silence in the face of obvious racism was complicity. He found himself hoping someone else would intervene so he wouldn't have to. The psychological dynamics in the cabin were reaching a critical point. Richard's aggression was feeding on the lack of opposition. The longer no one challenged his behavior, the more emboldened he became. Marcus's calm responses were being interpreted by Richard as fear or submission, encouraging him to push harder. What Richard didn't understand was that Marcus Williams had learned patience from his mother's strategy from his mentor, and power from building a billion-dollar company before his 20th birthday. The teenager wasn't afraid. He wasn't intimidated. He was collecting evidence. Elena Rodriguez was facing her own crisis of judgment. Company policy required her to intervene in passenger disputes, but Richard was clearly an important customer. His expensive clothes and aggressive attitude marked him as someone who could cause problems for her career if she handled the situation incorrectly. Marcus, despite having a valid ticket, looked like exactly the kind of passenger she'd been warned about in informal conversations with other crew members. Young black, casually dressed, probably flying on some kind of upgrade or mistake. Her hesitation was exactly what Marcus had been investigating. The gap between written policy and actual practice. The space where bias lived and thrived despite the best intentions. Captain Morrison was completing his pre-flight checks, unaware that his airline's owner was being harassed in Seat 2A. As a 20-year veteran pilot with Apex Airways, Morrison prided himself on running a tight ship and treating all passengers with professional courtesy. But he was also a man of his generation, shaped by assumptions about who belonged where and what young black men in hoodies were likely to be doing in first class. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every person in that aircraft. Richard Blackwood was about to discover that arrogance has consequences. Marcus Williams was about to reveal that power doesn't always announce itself. And everyone else was about to learn that silence in the face of injustice makes you part of the problem. But first, Richard had to commit an act so shocking, so public, and so legally indefensible that it would ensure his complete destruction. He was about to cross a line that would change multiple lives forever. The countdown continued. 8 minutes to impact. And Richard Blackwood was accelerating toward the moment when his world would collapse around him. Richard's frustration was mounting with each passing moment. The teenager's calm responses were making him look foolish, and the growing audience of passengers was witnessing his failure to intimidate someone who should have been cowering by now. "You know what Richard said," his voice climbing in pitch. "I don't believe a word of this corporate account nonsense. Kids like you don't work for companies that can afford first-class travel. You probably stole that credit card from your employer." Marcus looked up from his book again, his expression unchanged. "That's an interesting theory, Mr. Blackwood." The use of his name caught Richard off guard. He hadn't introduced himself, which meant the teenager had been paying closer attention than he'd realized. "How do you know my name?" "Your boarding announcement," Marcus said simply. "Gate agent called for Mr. Blackwood, priority boarding. I have a good memory for names." Richard felt a flush of embarrassment. The kid was making him look paranoid in front of everyone. "Time to regain control of the narrative." "Elena." Richard snapped at the flight attendant. I want this boy's ticket verified through your corporate system. Not just the name, I want to know exactly who paid for this seat and when." Elena glanced nervously between Richard and Marcus. Company protocol required her to accommodate reasonable passenger requests, but Richard's demand felt excessive and potentially discriminatory. However, Richard's expensive suit and aggressive demeanor suggested he was someone important enough to cause serious problems for her career. "Mr. Blackwood, I've already confirmed that Mr. Williams has a valid ticket." "I don't care what you confirmed," Richard interrupted. "I want proof that he didn't steal this seat or use a stolen credit card or commit fraud to get here, because I guarantee you a kid dressed like that doesn't have legitimate business in first class." Marcus closed his book completely now and placed it carefully in his lap. "Mr. Blackwood, are you accusing me of theft? I'm stating the obvious," Richard shot back. "You don't belong here. The sooner we all stop pretending otherwise, the sooner we can fix this situation." Tom Bradley, the teacher, recording from seat 3B, felt his stomach tighten. He'd seen this exact dynamic in his classroom, an adult using their authority to humiliate a young person who couldn't fight back. But this wasn't his classroom, and he wasn't sure what authority he had to intervene. Maria Santos was having a similar internal struggle. As a nurse, she'd been trained to de-escalate tense situations, but as a passenger, she wasn't sure if intervention would help or make things worse. Richard's aggression was clearly escalating, and the teenager's composure seemed to be fueling his rage rather than calming it. Elena Richard continued. "I want to speak with the captain. There's obviously been some kind of security breach that allowed this passenger into first class, and I want it addressed immediately." Elena felt the weight of multiple pressures. Richard was demanding action that felt discriminatory, but he was also a paying customer, making what could be interpreted as legitimate security concerns. Marcus had done nothing wrong, but his presence was clearly causing a disturbance that was affecting other passengers. "Sir, I can call the captain if you'd like, but I want to assure you that all our passengers have been properly screened and—" "Don't give me bureaucratic nonsense," Richard snapped. "I want action. Either this kid gets moved to economy where he belongs, or I want my ticket refunded and a seat on a real airline that knows how to handle passenger screening." The threat of a refund and bad publicity struck at Elena's deepest fears. Passenger complaints could derail her career, especially if they came from someone wealthy enough to afford first-class tickets regularly. Marcus Williams watched this exchange with growing concern, not for himself but for Elena. He could see her struggling between her training and her fears between doing what was right and protecting her job. This was exactly the kind of impossible situation his employees shouldn't have to face. Elena Marcus said quietly, "You don't need to call the captain. Mr. Blackwood and I can resolve this ourselves." Richard's head snapped toward Marcus, his eyes blazing. "There's nothing to resolve, boy. You're going to economy or you're getting off this plane. Those are your only options." "I appreciate your concern about seating arrangements," Marcus replied, his voice still calm, "but I'm comfortable where I am. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable if you focused on your own travel experience." The subtle rebuke hit Richard like a slap. This teenager, this child, was talking to him like an equal. Worse, he was talking to him like a subordinate who needed guidance. The humiliation was unbearable. "Don't you dare try to manage me," Richard hissed, leaning closer to Marcus's seat. "I've been traveling first class since before you were born. I've closed deals worth more money than you'll see in your entire lifetime, and I will not be lectured by some affirmative action charity case who probably can't even afford the peanuts they serve in coach." The racist language sent a shock through the cabin. Mrs. Patricia Chen gasped audibly. Dr. Wilson looked up from his magazine with a frown. Even passengers in business class were starting to turn around to see what was happening in first class. David Park's live tweeting had attracted hundreds of retweets with followers asking for updates on what was clearly becoming a serious incident. The hashtag Apex Airways bias was beginning to trend as word spread through social media. Marcus Williams felt something shift inside him. Not anger, his mother had taught him better than that, but a kind of crystalline clarity about what was really happening in this moment. Richard wasn't just attacking him personally. He was attacking every young person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Every minority who'd been questioned and humiliated and diminished by people who looked just like Richard. Mr. Blackwood Marcus said, his voice taking on a new quality, still quiet but with an underlying steel that made several passengers look up. "I think you should be very careful about your next words." Richard interpreted this as a threat which inflamed his rage even further. "Are you threatening me? Did everyone hear that? This kid just threatened me. I didn't threaten you," Marcus replied calmly. "I suggested you think before you speak. Don't tell me how to think." Richard exploded. "I don't take orders from people like you." The conversation was spiraling beyond Elena's ability to manage. She could see that Richard was becoming increasingly aggressive while Marcus's calm responses seemed to be making things worse rather than better. Other passengers were starting to voice complaints about the disruption, and the boarding process had essentially stopped while everyone watched the confrontation unfold. "Gentlemen," Elena said, trying to inject authority into her voice, "I need you both to lower your voices. We have other passengers trying to board and—" "I don't need to lower anything," Richard snarled. "What I need is for this airline to explain how a teenager with a fake ID and a student credit card ended up in a seat that costs more than his monthly allowance." Marcus had heard enough. "Mr. Blackwood, my identification isn't fake. My ticket is legitimate, and your behavior is unacceptable. I'm asking you politely to stop harassing me." "Harassing you?" Richard's laugh was ugly and sharp. "You think this is harassment? This is me protecting the integrity of first-class service. This is me making sure standards are maintained. And if you don't like it, you can take your fake ticket and your attitude back to whatever government program you crawled out of." The cabin had gone dead silent now. Even the flight attendants in business class had stopped their pre-flight preparations to listen. Captain Morrison, still unaware of the situation, was running through his final checks in the cockpit. Tom Bradley couldn't stay silent anymore. "Hey," he called out from seat 3B. "That's enough. The kid hasn't done anything wrong." Richard spun around to face this new challenger. "Mind your own business. This doesn't concern you. It concerns everyone on this plane," Tom replied, his teacher's instincts kicking in. "You're creating a disturbance and you're being completely inappropriate to another passenger." "Inappropriate?" Richard's voice cracked with indignation. "What's inappropriate is letting unqualified passengers into first class and expecting paying customers to just accept it." Maria Santos finally spoke up. "Sir, he has a ticket just like you do. What's the problem?" Richard looked around the cabin, suddenly realizing he had an audience that wasn't entirely sympathetic. But instead of backing down, he decided to double down. "The problem," he said loudly, "is that airlines have standards for a reason. First class isn't for everyone. It's for people who earn it. People who contribute to society. People who... What?" Marcus interrupted his voice, still quiet, but now carrying an edge that made everyone listen. "People who look like you." The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Richard's face flushed red with rage and embarrassment. The teenager had just accused him of racism in front of a plane full of witnesses, and the accusation was so obviously accurate that denial would only make him look worse. "You want to play the race card?" Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Fine. Let's talk about reality. Let's talk about merit. Let's talk about people earning what they get instead of having it handed to them because of some diversity quota. Mr. Blackwood." Elena said desperately, "Please lower your voice. You're disturbing other passengers, and I'm disturbing them." Richard's voice climbed again. "What about him? What about this whole charade?" You think I don't know what's really happening here? He turned back to Marcus, pointing an accusatory finger inches from the teenager's face. You're probably some kind of social media setup, aren't you? Recording this conversation so you can play victim and go viral. Well, congratulations, kid. You picked the wrong target. I don't get intimidated by publicity stunts. Marcus looked at the finger pointing at his face, then at Richard's flushed, angry expression. Mr. Blackwood, I'm not recording anything. I'm not trying to create content. I'm simply trying to travel to Miami in the seat I was assigned by who Richard demanded, who exactly assigned a college kid a first-class seat on a Tuesday afternoon flight. My employer, Marcus, said simply, "What employer? What company? And don't give me some vague nonsense about aviation. I want specifics." Marcus Williams looked at Richard Blackwood for a long moment. He thought about his mother, who had taught him to respond to hatred with dignity. He thought about his mentor, who had taught him that power should be exercised carefully and strategically. He thought about the $2 billion in assets he controlled and the responsibility that came with that wealth. And then he thought about every young person who had ever been made to feel small by someone like Richard Blackwood. "I work for Apex Airways," Marcus said quietly. Richard's laugh was triumphant and cruel. "Apex Airways? The company that owns this plane?" "Right. And I suppose you're going to tell me you're the CEO." Marcus Williams looked directly into Richard Blackwood's eyes and spoke with perfect, devastating calm. "I don't suppose anything, Mr. Blackwood. I am the CEO." For a moment, the cabin was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. Richard blinked several times, his brain struggling to process what he'd just heard. Then he exploded. "That's the most ridiculous lie I've ever heard," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You think I'm stupid? You think anyone on this plane is stupid enough to believe that a teenager in a hoodie owns an airline?" "Believe what you want," Marcus said. "It doesn't change reality." Richard's face had gone from red to purple. The teenager wasn't backing down, wasn't showing fear, wasn't acknowledging Richard's obvious superiority. And now he was telling outrageous lies that made Richard look like a fool for believing them. "You know what Richard said?" his voice shaking with rage. "I've had enough of this. Enough of your lies, enough of your attitude, enough of your presence in first class." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a bottle of water. Without warning, he twisted off the cap and poured the entire contents over Marcus's head. The water soaked through Marcus's hoodie, dripped onto his book, and pooled in his seat. Marcus sat perfectly still, water running down his face, his expression unchanged. The cabin erupted in gasps and shocked exclamations. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Tom Bradley shouted, standing up. Maria Santos was on her feet immediately. "That's assault. Elena, call the captain right now." But Richard wasn't finished. The teenager's lack of reaction was driving him to even greater fury. He reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out his phone. "You want to play games?" he snarled. "I'm calling airport security. I'm calling the police. I'm having you arrested for fraud, for trespassing, for terrorism, for all I know." Marcus Williams sat in his soaked hoodie, water still dripping from his hair, and spoke in a voice so calm it was almost conversational. "Mr. Blackwood, I strongly advise you to sit down and remain quiet." "Don't tell me what to do," Richard screamed. And then, in a moment that would be replayed millions of times on social media, analyzed by legal experts and studied in business schools as an example of how quickly a life can be destroyed by poor judgment. Richard Blackwood drew back his fist and punched Marcus Williams in the face. The sound of the impact echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Marcus's head snapped back, blood immediately beginning to flow from his nose and a cut above his left eyebrow where Richard's class ring had connected. For a moment, absolute silence filled the aircraft. Then chaos erupted. The silence that followed the punch lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the cabin exploded into chaos. "Oh my God, Mrs." Patricia Chen screamed from seat 1A, her hands flying to her mouth. "Call 911. Dr. Wilson shouted, jumping to his feet. That man just assaulted a minor. Tom Bradley was already on his phone, frantically dialing airport security while simultaneously trying to keep his camera focused on the scene. "I got it all," he called out to no one in particular. "I recorded everything." Maria Santos pushed past the frozen flight attendant and knelt beside Marcus, her nurse training kicking in automatically. Blood was streaming from the cut above his eyebrow, and his nose was clearly broken. "Don't move," she told Marcus, her voice professional and calm, despite the chaos around them. "Let me look at those injuries." Marcus Williams sat perfectly still in his soaked, blood-stained seat, looking up at Richard Blackwood with an expression that was impossible to read. Blood dripped steadily onto his ruined textbook, but his voice remained steady. "Mr. Blackwood," he said quietly, "you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Richard was standing over him, his fist still clenched, his face a mask of rage and satisfaction. "The only mistake was letting you on this plane in the first place." David Park was live tweeting frantically. "Passenger just punched teenager in face on Apex Airways Flight 318. Unprovoked assault. This is insane." Apex Airways. Assault justice for Marcus. The hashtag would trend worldwide within the hour. Elena Rodriguez was paralyzed by the magnitude of what had just happened. In 8 years of flying, she'd never witnessed an actual assault. Her training had covered de-escalation techniques, but nothing had prepared her for a passenger attacking another passenger with his fists. Elena Maria snapped from where she was examining Marcus's injuries. "Get the captain, now, and get me the first aid kit." Elena fumbled for her intercom button. "Captain Morrison, please come to first class immediately. We have a situation." Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. "Define situation, Elena." Elena looked around the cabin at the blood on Marcus's face, at Richard standing defiantly over his victim, at the other passengers recording everything with their phones. "We have an assault in progress, sir. I need you here immediately." Morrison's training kicked in. Assault meant federal crime. Federal crime meant FBI involvement. FBI involvement meant paperwork delays and career-threatening scrutiny. "I'm coming forward," Morrison said tersely. Richard Blackwood was experiencing a surge of satisfaction, unlike anything he'd felt in years. Finally, someone had put this arrogant teenager in his place. Finally, the natural order had been restored. He looked around the cabin expecting to see approval, or at least understanding, from the other first-class passengers. Instead, he saw horror and disgust. "You're sick," Mrs. Chen said, her voice shaking with emotion. "That's a child." "A child? He's not a child," Richard snapped back. "He's a criminal who conned his way into first class, and someone needed to teach him a lesson." Dr. Wilson was documenting Marcus's injuries with his medical training. Broken nose laceration above left eyebrow requiring stitches, possible concussion. This is serious assault, not some lesson. Tom Bradley had his phone out, live streaming to his Instagram followers. "This is unbelievable," he narrated. Business executive just punched a teenager for sitting in first class. The kid did nothing, just sat there reading a book. This is the most racist thing I've ever seen in person. The live stream was being watched by hundreds of viewers, with the number climbing rapidly as people shared the video across social media platforms. Maria Santos was applying pressure to the cut above Marcus's eyebrow with a clean napkin. "You need medical attention," she told him. "That cut is deep and your nose is definitely broken." Marcus tested his jaw carefully, wincing slightly. "I'll be fine. Thank you for helping me." "Don't thank me," Maria said fiercely. "This is insane. No one should have to deal with this." She turned to Richard, her professional composure cracking. "What is wrong with you? He's 19 years old. He was just sitting there." Richard's adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that perhaps he'd gone too far. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "He was lying," Richard said defensively. "Making up stories about owning airlines, trying to make me look stupid. You made yourself look stupid. Tom called out from his seat. "And now you're going to jail." David Park had switched from Twitter to Facebook, live streaming the aftermath to his network of followers. "The victim is handling this with incredible dignity," he narrated. "Still hasn't raised his voice, still hasn't fought back." Meanwhile, the attacker is trying to justify hitting a teenager. The Facebook live stream was attracting viewers from around the world, with comments flooding in expressing outrage and support for Marcus. Captain Morrison appeared at the curtain dividing first class from business, taking in the scene with professional assessment. He saw the blood, the injured passenger, the agitated crowd, and the man standing defiantly in the aisle. "What happened here?" Morrison demanded. Elena quickly summarized the escalating confrontation, the racial harassment, and the physical assault. As she spoke, Morrison's expression grew increasingly grave. Mr. Blackwood, Morrison said sternly, "I'm going to need you to sit down and remain calm while we sort this out." "There's nothing to sort out," Richard replied. "I defended myself against a fraudulent passenger who threatened me." Tom Bradley spoke up immediately. "That's a lie. I recorded the whole thing. The kid never threatened anyone. This guy attacked him for no reason except racism." Morrison looked at the teenager, noting the blood, the calm demeanor, and the expensive textbook soaked in red. Something about the situation felt wrong, not just the assault, but something else he couldn't quite identify. "Son, what's your name?" Morrison asked gently. Marcus Williams looked up at Captain Morrison, and for the first time since boarding the flight, something shifted in his expression, a kind of recognition, as if he was seeing the captain for the first time. "Marcus Williams," he said quietly. "And Captain Morrison, I think we need to talk." Morrison blinked. How did this injured teenager know his name? He hadn't introduced himself, and passengers typically didn't know pilot names. Unless... "Do I know you?" Morrison asked, a strange feeling growing in his stomach. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "You do." Richard was growing impatient with this conversation. "Can we focus on the real issue here? This kid conned his way into first class and then threatened me when I confronted him about it." Maria Santos stood up from where she'd been treating Marcus's injuries. "Stop lying. I saw the whole thing. You attacked an innocent person." "Innocent?" Richard laughed bitterly. "He claimed to be the CEO of Apex Airways. That's fraud. That's..." Captain Morrison went very, very still. "What did you say?" Morrison asked Richard, his voice suddenly sharp. "I said he claimed to be the CEO of Apex Airways," Richard repeated. "Obviously a ridiculous lie to try to intimidate me." Morrison slowly turned to look at Marcus Williams, at the young black man with blood on his face and water stains on his hoodie, at the teenager he'd been flying for Apex Airways for 2 years without ever meeting in person. Mr. Williams, Morrison said carefully, "What's your employee identification number?" Marcus recited a long string of digits from memory. Morrison's face went pale. "What's the current status of our Los Angeles route expansion?" Morrison asked. "Suspended pending FAA approval of the new terminal gates," Marcus replied immediately. "Expected completion date is March 15th unless the environmental impact study reveals unexpected complications." Morrison's hands began to shake slightly. "What's my daughter's name?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus Williams looked at the man who had been flying for his company for 2 years, the man whose personnel file he'd reviewed personally, the man whose daughter had sent a thank you card when Apex Airways had donated to her school fundraiser. Sarah Marcus said gently, "She's 12 years old, and she wants to be a pilot like her father." Captain Morrison sat down heavily in the nearest seat. Richard Blackwood looked back and forth between Morrison and Marcus, confusion beginning to replace his anger. What's happening here?" Morrison looked up at Richard with an expression of pure horror. "Mr. Blackwood," he said slowly, "you just assaulted the owner of this airline." The cabin went dead silent again. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and finally absolute terror. That's impossible," he whispered. Tom Bradley's phone captured every second of Richard's reaction as the reality hit him. The live stream viewers were going wild in the comments, with thousands of people watching in real time as a racist bully realized he'd destroyed his own life. David Park was typing frantically, "Holy shit! The kid he punched actually owns the airline. This is the biggest karma moment I've ever seen." Maria Santos looked from Marcus to Morrison to Richard, pieces falling into place. "Oh my God," she breathed. "You really are the CEO." Marcus Williams' blood still trickling from his eyebrow looked around the cabin at the shocked faces, the recording phones, and the man who had just committed career suicide. "Yes," he said quietly. "I really am." Richard Blackwood swayed slightly, the full weight of his situation crashing down on him. He'd just assaulted a billionaire. On camera, in front of witnesses, on federal property. But Marcus Williams wasn't finished. Captain Morrison. Marcus said, his voice carrying new authority despite the blood on his face. "I need you to contact federal air marshals immediately. We're going to divert to the nearest airport, and Mr. Blackwood is going to be arrested for assault." Morrison nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "Absolutely, sir." Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket, water dripping from the case. "And Captain, I'm about to make some personnel changes. I hope you understand." Morrison's face went ashen as he realized his job was likely forfeit for failing to protect the company's owner. But Marcus Williams had bigger plans than just firing a pilot. Richard Blackwood had started a war he couldn't possibly win. And Marcus was about to show him exactly what power looked like when it was wielded with purpose. The countdown was almost over. In less than 3 minutes, Richard Blackwood's world would collapse entirely. But first, Marcus Williams was going to make sure everyone understood exactly what happened when you confused quiet dignity with weakness. Marcus Williams wiped blood from his lip with the back of his hand and looked directly at Captain Morrison. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Captain Morrison, this is Marcus Williams. Authorization code Alpha 97. I need federal air marshals notified immediately, and I want this aircraft diverted to the nearest suitable airport." Morrison's years of training kicked in despite his shock. "When the owner of your airline gives you direct orders, you follow them without question." "Roger that, Mr. Williams," Morrison said, reaching for his radio. "Ground control, this is Apex Flight 318, requesting emergency diversion. We have a federal assault case on board requiring law enforcement intervention." Richard Blackwood stood frozen in the aisle, his brain struggling to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. Teenagers didn't own airlines. College kids in hoodies weren't worth billions of dollars. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank or misunderstanding. "This is insane," Richard muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You can't be serious." Marcus turned his attention to his injured face, testing his jaw and checking the flow of blood from his eyebrow. Then he pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact labeled Crisis Management, Nia Thompson. The call connected after one ring. "Mr. Williams." The voice was crisp, professional, and immediately alert. "Are you all right? Your location shows you're still on Flight 3118. Nia. I need you to execute Protocol 7. Marcus said calmly, ignoring the gasps from passengers who were hearing him issue executive orders while blood dripped from his face. "Sir, Protocol 7 is permanent termination for discriminatory practices that affects multiple employees across several departments." "Are you certain?" Marcus looked around the cabin at Elena Rodriguez, who had failed to protect him from harassment, at the business class flight attendants who had watched the confrontation without intervening, at the ground crew who had allowed Richard Blackwood's behavior to escalate unchecked. "I'm certain." Start with Flight 388's crew roster, then expand to anyone who has unresolved discrimination complaints in their file. Understood, sir. How many personnel should I target? All of them? The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena Rodriguez's face went white as she realized her career with Apex Airways had just ended. Tom Bradley was still live streaming his audience, growing by thousands every minute. This is unreal, he narrated. The CEO is firing people while bleeding from being punched in the face. This is the most insane thing I've ever witnessed. David Park had switched to Twitter, posting updates that were being retweeted thousands of times per minute. CEO of Apex Airways just fired entire crew from his hospital seat after being assaulted. Stock is already moving on this. Apex Airways assault Dr. Wilson was still focused on Marcus's medical needs. Son, you need to get to a hospital. That cut needs stitches and you may have a concussion. Thank you, doctor. I'll be fine until we land. Marcus returned his attention to his phone. Nia, I also need you to contact the SEC. Mr. Richard Blackwood is about to become the subject of a federal investigation. What kind of investigation? Sir Marcus looked directly at Richard, who was standing motionless in the aisle like a statue of terror. Securities fraud, corporate misconduct, civil rights violations. Let the lawyers be creative. Richard finally found his voice. You can't do this to me. I have rights. I have lawyers. Yes, you do, Marcus agreed. And you're going to need them. Marcus's next call was to another number in his phone legal department, Sarah Kim. Dr. Sarah Kim had been Marcus's mentor since he was 14 years old. Now she served as general counsel for Apex Airways, overseeing a legal department that had never lost a major case. Dr. Kim's voice was warm but concerned. Nia just briefed me. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I'm fine, Dr. Kim. But I need you to file assault charges against Richard Blackwood immediately. Federal assault civil rights violations, and we're going after him personally for every dollar he has. Consider it done. I'm already pulling his background information. Investment banker, significant assets, no prior criminal record. This is going to destroy his life. That's the idea. Richard was listening to this conversation with growing horror. His entire career, his reputation, his financial security, everything was being dismantled by a teenager with a bloody nose who was making phone calls like he was ordering pizza. Wait, Richard said desperately. Wait, let's talk about this. Maybe we can work something out. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. Marcus Williams looked at Richard Blackwood with the same calm expression he'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Mr. Blackwood, 47 minutes ago, you told me I didn't belong in first class. 33 minutes ago, you questioned my right to be on this aircraft. 18 minutes ago, you poured water on my head. 3 minutes ago, you punched me in the face. What part of that was a misunderstanding? The precision of the timeline was chilling. Marcus had been tracking every moment, every escalation, every witness, every piece of evidence. Captain Morrison was coordinating with ground control, but he kept glancing back at the scene unfolding in first class. Mr. Williams, we're cleared for emergency landing at Dallas Love Field. Federal agents will be waiting. Thank you, Captain. And Captain, after we land, I'll need to speak with you about your future with Apex Airways. Morrison's face crumpled. 20 years of flying and his career was ending because he'd failed to recognize his own boss being assaulted. But Marcus wasn't finished demonstrating the scope of his power. His next call was to someone labeled in his contacts as Media Relations, James Park. James, I need you to coordinate a press conference for this afternoon. Location, Dallas Love Field Airport. Topic, Apex Airways' response to onboard discrimination and assault. Sir, are you the victim? I am. Jesus Christ. Okay, I'll have every major news outlet there within 2 hours. What's your message? Zero tolerance, complete accountability, and immediate industry-wide reform. Maria Santos was watching this display of power with amazement. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured to Dr. Wilson. "He's dismantling that man's entire life with phone calls." Mrs. Patricia Chen, the elderly widow in 1A, had been quietly observing the entire situation. "That young man has more dignity in his bleeding face than that bully has in his whole body," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The other passengers were documenting everything on social media. Apex Airways' assault was trending worldwide. Justice for Marcus was gaining momentum. Videos of the assault were being viewed millions of times. But Marcus Williams had one more call to make. This one to a number most people would never have access to federal relations. Director Patricia Hayes. Director Hayes answered immediately. "Mr. Williams, I understand there's been an incident. Director Hayes, I've just been assaulted on one of my aircraft by a passenger who spent the better part of an hour harassing me with racial slurs and discriminatory behavior. Everything was recorded by multiple witnesses. We'll have agents waiting when you land. This will be handled with full federal authority. Thank you. I also want this case to set precedent. I want it clear that commercial aviation has zero tolerance for discrimination or violence. Consider it done." Richard Blackwood was listening to Marcus coordinate his arrest and prosecution with federal authorities like he was scheduling a business meeting. The casualness was terrifying. "Please," Richard whispered. "I have a family. I have children. I was having a bad day. I didn't mean—" Marcus Williams looked at Richard Blackwood for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute judgment. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm 19 years old. I've been building this airline since I was 17. I've never had a bad day that made me want to hurt someone because of their race. I've never been frustrated enough to pour water on someone's head. I've never been angry enough to punch someone in the face." He paused, letting that sink in. "Your bad day isn't an excuse, it's a choice. And now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." Tom Bradley's live stream audience had grown to over 50,000 viewers, all watching in real time, as one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in modern history played out in the first-class cabin of a commercial aircraft. Elena Rodriguez finally found her voice. "Mr. Williams, I'm sorry. I should have stopped this earlier. I should have protected you." Marcus looked at the flight attendant who had failed in her most basic responsibility. "Elena, you're right. You should have. Your termination letter will be in your email when we land." The coldness was shocking. No anger, no emotion, just the simple administrative reality of accountability. Captain Morrison keyed his radio again. "Ground Control, Apex 318 is beginning descent to Dallas Love, requesting priority handling for federal law enforcement boarding. Roger, Apex 318. Priority approved. Federal agents standing by." Marcus made one final call, this one to a number labeled simply Mom. Marcus. His mother's voice was warm and concerned. "Shouldn't you be in the air right now, Mom? I'm fine, but I'm going to be on the news tonight. I wanted you to hear it from me first." "What happened, baby?" "Someone on my flight thought I didn't belong in first class." He made that opinion very clear. There was a pause. Marcus's mother had raised him alone, working double shifts as a nurse to pay for his education. She'd taught him dignity, strength, and the difference between justice and revenge. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. Just some cuts and bruises." "Did you handle it the way I taught you?" Marcus Williams looked around the cabin at Richard Blackwood, who was sitting now with his head in his hands. At Elena Rodriguez, who was quietly crying. At the passengers who had witnessed everything and recorded it all. "Yes, Mom. I handled it exactly the way you taught me." "Good. I'm proud of you. I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby. Come home safe." Marcus hung up and looked at Richard Blackwood one final time. "Mr. Blackwood, when we land, Federal agents are going to arrest you for assault and civil rights violations. You'll be processed, charged, and held pending trial. Your assets will be frozen during the investigation. Your employer will distance themselves from you. Your family will see you on every news channel in America. Richard was weeping now, the full magnitude of his situation finally sinking in. But here's what I want you to understand. Marcus continued, his voice gentle but implacable. This isn't happening because you're white and I'm black. This isn't happening because you're older and I'm younger. This isn't happening because you're rich and I'm richer. He leaned forward slightly. This is happening because you chose to be cruel to someone you thought couldn't fight back. And it turns out you were wrong about that. The plane began its descent toward Dallas Love Field, where federal agents, news crews, and the consequences of Richard Blackwood's choices were waiting. Dallas Love Field had never seen anything quite like it. By the time Apex Airways Flight 3018 touched down at 4:17 p.m., the small regional airport had been transformed into the epicenter of a media firestorm that was reshaping conversations about racism, corporate accountability, and justice in America. Federal agents in black SUVs were positioned at strategic points around the aircraft. News vans from CNN, Fox News, NBC, ABC, and local Dallas stations lined the perimeter of the tarmac. Social media had exploded with hashtags and viral videos that were being shared millions of times across every platform. The assault of Marcus Williams was becoming one of the most documented acts of airline discrimination in history. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was surreal. Marcus Williams sat calmly in his blood-stained hoodie, occasionally dabbing at the cut above his eyebrow while coordinating the destruction of Richard Blackwood's life through a series of phone calls that were being witnessed and recorded by dozens of passengers. Richard himself had not spoken for the last 15 minutes of the flight. He sat in his expensive suit worth more than most people's cars and stared at his hands while his world collapsed around him in real time. Tom Bradley was providing live commentary to his now massive social media following. We're on the ground now. You can see federal agents surrounding the plane. The CEO, he's 19 years old, by the way, is about to walk off this aircraft and hold a press conference that's going to change everything. The aircraft door opened, and the first person to board was Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. She was followed by 3 additional agents and a team of federal marshals. Mr. Williams, Agent Rodriguez approached Marcus with professional concern. I'm Agent Rodriguez. Are you the victim in this case? I am. Marcus stood slowly, testing his balance. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and his injuries were beginning to make themselves known. Agent Rodriguez looked at the blood on his face, the swelling around his nose, and the cut that was still seeping above his eyebrow. Sir, you need medical attention. We have paramedics standing by. After we handle Mr. Blackwood, Marcus said firmly, I want to see him arrested first. Agent Rodriguez nodded and turned to Richard. Mr. Richard Blackwood. Richard looked up with the expression of a man who had accepted his fate. Yes. You're under arrest for assault in the first-degree violation of federal civil rights statutes and creating a disturbance aboard a commercial aircraft. You have the right to remain silent. The Miranda rights echoed through the cabin as federal handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists. Tom Bradley captured every moment on his phone, live streaming the arrest to an audience that had grown to over 200,000 viewers. This is unprecedented, Tom narrated. A passenger is being arrested for assault, while the victim, who turns out to be the airline's owner, is coordinating a complete overhaul of his company in response. As Richard was being led off the aircraft, he stopped next to Marcus's seat. Please, he whispered, his voice broken. I have children. I have a family. Can't we? Marcus Williams looked at Richard Blackwood with an expression that was impossible to read. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but audible to everyone in first class. Mr. Blackwood, your children are going to see videos of their father punching a teenager in the face because he didn't like the color of his skin. They're going to have to live with that for the rest of their lives. So are you. Richard was led away without another word. Maria Santos had been watching this entire exchange with professional fascination. As an emergency room nurse, she'd seen the aftermath of violence countless times, but she'd never seen a victim handle trauma with such calculated composure. "How are you doing this?" she asked Marcus as federal agents finished clearing the aircraft. "How are you staying so calm?" Marcus looked at the nurse who had helped tend his injuries. "My mother taught me that dignity is something nobody can take from you. You can only give it away." Dr. Wilson was still concerned about Marcus's medical condition. "Son, you need to get checked out properly. Head trauma can be serious even when it doesn't look severe." "Doctor, I appreciate your concern. I promise I'll see a physician as soon as we finish here." What none of the passengers fully understood yet was that Marcus Williams was just getting started. The arrest of Richard Blackwood was merely the opening movement in a symphony of consequences that would reshape not just Apex Airways but the entire aviation industry. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Nia Thompson. Protocol 7 complete. 73 employees terminated across 15 airports. Stock price up 4.7% on news of swift accountability measures. Media requesting interviews. When do you want to address the public? Marcus typed back press conference in 30 minutes. Airport conference room. Make sure the passengers from this flight are invited. They're witnesses to history. As the remaining passengers disembarked, many of them approached Marcus to offer support exchange contact information, or simply express their amazement at what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Patricia Chen stopped at his row and patted his hand gently. "Young man, you handled that with more grace than most people twice your age. Your mother raised you right." "Thank you, ma'am. That means a great deal." David Park, the software engineer who had been live tweeting the entire incident, shook Marcus's hand. "I've been in tech for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. You turned a hate crime into a masterclass in leadership. I just did what needed to be done." Captain Morrison was the last to approach, his face haggard with the realization that his career was over. "Mr. Williams, I failed you today. I failed my company. I have no excuse." Marcus looked at the pilot who had served Apex Airways faithfully for 2 years. "Captain Morrison, you made a mistake. But your record shows you're a good pilot and a decent man. Your termination notice will include a recommendation letter for other airlines." Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, thank you. Captain, one more thing. When you're hired by another airline, remember what happened here today. Remember what happens when good people stay silent while bad things happen." "Yes, sir. I will." The press conference was held in Dallas Love Field's largest conference room, hastily converted to accommodate the mob of journalists, cameramen, and photographers who had descended on the airport. Marcus Williams, his injuries cleaned and bandaged by paramedics, but still visible, sat at a table facing a sea of cameras and recording devices. To his left sat Dr. Sarah Kim, his mentor and general counsel. To his right sat Tom Bradley and Maria Santos, the passengers who had intervened during the assault. Behind them, projected on a large screen, was the Apex Airways logo next to the words, "Zero Tolerance, Complete Accountability." Marcus began without notes or prepared remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. My name is Marcus Williams. I am 19 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Airways. This afternoon, aboard one of my aircraft, I was subjected to nearly an hour of racial harassment that culminated in a physical assault that left me with these injuries." He gestured to his bandaged face, and camera flashes erupted throughout the room. The assault was witnessed by passengers, recorded by multiple individuals, and documented by our aircraft's internal security systems. The perpetrator, Mr. Richard Blackwood, has been arrested by federal agents and will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. A reporter from CNN raised her hand. "Mr. Williams, can you tell us why you were traveling incognito? Did you suspect you might face discrimination? I travel regularly on my airline to monitor service quality and passenger experience. Unfortunately, I've received numerous complaints about discriminatory treatment, particularly toward young passengers of color. Today, I experienced that discrimination firsthand." A Fox News reporter spoke up. "What's your response to critics who might say that firing 73 employees is an overreaction to one incident?" Marcus's expression hardened slightly. This wasn't one incident. This was the culmination of a pattern of bias that I've been tracking for months. Every employee terminated today had unresolved discrimination complaints, documented bias incidents, or failures to protect passengers from harassment. I will not tolerate discrimination at any level of my company. The questions continued for 20 minutes, with Marcus answering each one with the kind of poise and clarity that seasoned executives twice his age struggled to achieve. The press conference was being broadcast live on every major news network and streaming across social media platforms worldwide. But the real bombshell came at the end when a reporter from the Wall Street Journal asked about the broader implications of the incident. "Mr. Williams, beyond your own company, what changes do you think this incident should inspire across the aviation industry?" Marcus leaned forward, his dark eyes intense despite his injuries. "Effective immediately, Apex Airways is launching the Aviation Dignity Initiative, a comprehensive program to eliminate discrimination in air travel. We're creating an industry-wide database to track bias incidents, developing new training protocols for all aviation personnel, and establishing an independent oversight board to investigate complaints." He paused, letting that sink in. "But more importantly, we're making this technology open source. Every airline, every airport, every aviation company in the world will have access to these tools. Because dignity in travel shouldn't be a competitive advantage. It should be a basic human right." The room erupted in questions, but Marcus stood up, signaling the press conference was over. "I'll take one final question." A young reporter from a local Dallas station raised her hand. "Mr. Williams, what would you say to other young people who face discrimination but don't have the power to fight back the way you did?" Marcus Williams looked directly into the camera, speaking to an audience of millions around the world. "I would say this: document everything. Speak up when you can. Find allies wherever you find them. And remember that power isn't about money or position or status. Real power is about refusing to accept that cruelty is normal." He stood up from the table, Dr. Kim and the passenger witnesses rising with him. "And to anyone who thinks they can treat others with disrespect because of their age, their race, or their appearance, I want you to remember Richard Blackwood. Remember how quickly a moment of hatred can destroy a lifetime of success. Remember that your victims might be stronger than you think. And remember that in an age of cameras and social media and instant justice, your worst moment might become the moment that defines your entire life." The press conference ended, but the consequences were just beginning. Within hours, Richard Blackwood's arrest photos were on every major news website. His investment firm had issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions. His wife had filed for emergency separation. His children's private school was dealing with media requests about their response to having the child of a federal hate crime perpetrator in their student body. Marcus Williams, meanwhile, was being hailed as a hero, a visionary, and a symbol of how justice could work when victims had the power to demand accountability. But Marcus wasn't interested in being a symbol. He was interested in making sure that what happened to him never happened to anyone else. The revolution in aviation had begun, sparked by the moment when silence became impossible and justice became inevitable. Richard Blackwood had wanted to teach a lesson about knowing your place. Instead, he'd learned that in modern America, everyone's place was equal, and some people had the power to enforce that equality with devastating precision. The countdown was complete. Impact had occurred, and the shockwaves were only just beginning to spread. 6 months later, Marcus Williams stood before a packed Senate hearing room, his testimony being broadcast live to millions of Americans who had followed his story from that bloody afternoon on Flight 318 to this moment of institutional change. The scar above his left eyebrow had faded, but remained visible, a permanent reminder of the day. Silence became impossible. Senator Patricia Hayes, the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, leaned forward at the witness table. Mr. Williams, in your expert opinion, has the Aviation Dignity Initiative succeeded in its goals? Marcus looked across the hearing room, noting the diverse faces of the senators, the packed gallery of advocates and industry representatives, and the cameras that would carry his words across the country. Senator Hayes. The numbers speak for themselves. Discrimination complaints across all participating airlines have decreased by 67%. Customer satisfaction scores have reached historic highs. Most importantly, we haven't had a single incident of passenger assault based on racial bias since the initiative launched. The statistics were staggering. What had begun as one teenager's response to being punched in the face had transformed into an industry-wide revolution. More than 200 airlines worldwide had adopted the aviation dignity protocols. Federal regulations now required bias training for all aviation personnel. The Independent Oversight Board had investigated over 3,000 complaints and implemented changes that had fundamentally altered how people experienced air travel. But the most profound changes weren't captured in statistics. Dr. James Wilson, the cardiologist who had witnessed the original assault, was now serving on the Aviation Dignity Initiative's Medical Advisory Board, helping develop protocols for treating discrimination-related trauma. His testimony from Flight 318 had become a cornerstone case study in bystander intervention training. Maria Santos had become a national spokesperson for the initiative, using her nursing background to educate aviation personnel about the health impacts of discriminatory treatment. Her quick intervention to treat Marcus's injuries had made her a symbol of how ordinary people could choose to help rather than merely watch. Tom Bradley had parlayed his live-stream documentation of the incident into a career as an investigative journalist focused on civil rights issues. His footage of Richard Blackwood's arrest remained one of the most watched videos in social media history, a permanent record of how quickly justice could be served when victims refused to accept mistreatment. Captain Morrison had indeed found employment with another airline, where he now served as a training supervisor specifically focused on anti-discrimination protocols. His failure on Flight 318 had become the foundation for one of the most effective bias prevention programs in commercial aviation. Even Elena Rodriguez had found redemption. After her termination from Apex Airways, she had completed extensive bias training and now worked for the Aviation Dignity Initiative, directly helping other flight attendants understand their responsibility to protect all passengers from harassment. But what had happened to Richard Blackwood served as a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond the aviation industry. The federal prosecution had been swift and decisive. Convicted on all charges, assault, civil rights violations, and disrupting commercial aviation, Richard had received a sentence of 3 years in federal prison plus substantial financial penalties. His investment career had ended the day of his arrest. His assets had been liquidated to pay legal fees and civil damages. His wife had divorced him and moved their children to another state to escape the publicity. Marcus had visited Richard in prison exactly once, 6 months after the conviction. It wasn't for Richard's benefit, it was for his own peace of mind. "Why did you come?" Richard had asked through the glass partition, his expensive suit replaced by federal prison orange, his arrogant demeanor broken by months of consequences. "To make sure I didn't become like you," Marcus had replied quietly. "To make sure that having power over your life didn't make me cruel the way having power over mine made you cruel." Richard had wept, then finally understanding the full scope of what his moment of hatred had cost both of them. "I destroyed my children's lives," Richard had whispered. "They can't escape what I did." Every Google search of their names brings up videos of their father punching a teenager. Yes, Marcus had agreed. They can't escape it. But they can choose how to respond to it. They can choose to be better than you were. That conversation had stayed with Marcus through the months of hearings, interviews, and institutional changes that followed. The goal had never been revenge. It had been justice. Justice for himself, but more importantly, justice for everyone who would travel after him. Now sitting before the Senate committee, Marcus Williams felt the weight of that responsibility. Mr. Williams, Senator Hayes continued, "What lessons do you think the American people should take from your experience?" Marcus considered the question carefully. In the gallery behind him, he could see his mother, who had flown in from Baltimore to watch her son testify before Congress. He could see Dr. Sarah Kim, his mentor, who had guided him through both building his company and surviving the trauma of assault. He could see representatives from dozens of civil rights organizations, victim advocacy groups, and business leaders who had embraced the changes he'd fought for. "Senator, I think there are several lessons. First, that discrimination doesn't just hurt individuals, it hurts institutions. Every employee we fired, every policy we changed, every dollar we invested in making our company better was money we could have saved if we'd simply treated people with dignity from the beginning." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Second, that technology and social media have fundamentally changed the accountability equation. Richard Blackwood thought he could humiliate a teenager with no consequences because he'd probably done similar things before without being caught. But in an age where everyone has a camera and every injustice can be documented and shared instantly, that kind of behavior has become incredibly dangerous for the perpetrator. A murmur of agreement rippled through the hearing room. But the most important lesson, Marcus continued, is that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality. Every passenger on that flight had a choice. They could speak up or they could look away. The ones who spoke up became part of the solution. The ones who stayed silent became part of the problem. Senator Hayes nodded approvingly. "And what would you say to young people who face discrimination but don't have the resources to fight back the way you were able to?" This was the question Marcus had been hoping for. "I would say that power doesn't come from money or position or status. Real power comes from refusing to accept that being treated poorly is normal. Document everything. Build alliances with people who share your values. Use whatever platforms you have access to: social media, local news community organizations, schools, churches. And remember that every victory, no matter how small, makes the next victory possible." Marcus leaned forward, speaking directly to the cameras. "Richard Blackwood thought he could humiliate me because I was young, black, and alone. He was wrong about all three. I wasn't young in the ways that mattered. I had been building power and resources for years. I wasn't alone. There were witnesses who chose to help rather than look away. And my race, which he thought made me vulnerable, actually connected me to a network of supporters who understood exactly what was happening and why it mattered." The hearing room was completely quiet now. But here's what I want every young person to understand. You don't need to be a billionaire to demand dignity. You just need to believe that you deserve it and be willing to fight for it. Senator Hayes smiled. "Mr. Williams, any final thoughts for the committee?" Marcus Williams looked around the hearing room one final time, thinking about the journey from that bloody afternoon on Flight 3 in 18 to this moment of institutional change. "Senator, 6 months ago I was just a teenager trying to fly home from a business trip. I wasn't trying to become a symbol or start a movement or change an industry. I was just trying to travel with dignity." He touched the faded scar above his eyebrow. "But sometimes the world chooses you to be part of something bigger than yourself. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can be bitter about the pain you suffered, or you can use that pain to make sure no one else has to suffer the same way." Marcus stood up from the witness table, his testimony complete. "I chose to use the pain, and I hope that choice makes the world a little bit better for everyone who comes after me." The hearing room erupted in sustained applause as Marcus Williams walked away from the witness table and toward a future where his scars had become the foundation for lasting change. Richard Blackwood remained in federal prison, serving the consequences of his choices. His moment of hatred had indeed taught a lesson about power and respect, and knowing your place. Just not the lesson he'd intended to teach. And Marcus Williams, who had been told he didn't belong in first class, had used that moment of cruelty to ensure that everyone belonged everywhere, as long as they treated others with the dignity that every human being deserved. The revolution was complete. Justice had been served, and the sky was finally free for everyone. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity isn't negotiable and justice is possible, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, smash that like button. This story needs to reach everyone who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere. Second, subscribe and ring that notification bell, because stories like this, stories about real people fighting real injustice and winning, these are the stories that change the world. And third, share this video. Share it with your family, your friends, your co-workers. Share it with anyone who needs to remember that in an age of cameras and courage, nobody is above accountability. Because here's what Richard Blackwood forgot. Your worst moment doesn't have to stay private anymore. And sometimes that's exactly what justice looks like. Thanks for watching, and remember, when you stand up for what's right, you're never standing alone.